So a little over a year ago, I decided to devote a portion of my guitar playing journey solely to tone searching. And I know that's a very dangerous thing, but I thought it would be a really cool idea just to experiment with some of my pedals and to try and recreate some of the tones of like my all-time guitar heroes. So the obvious one that I was always trying to recreate was Mayer, but I was getting a little sick and tired of always being the Mayer wannabe kid, so I decided to actually look to a different John, a Mr. Frusciante. Now at the time, I only actually knew a couple brief things about the Frusciante tone. I knew that he had a 62 Sunburst Strat, and while I have never owned a big Marshall head, I did have a couple of different Boss pedals that I'd been using for a little bit. But I knew that there had to be more to the sound. There just had to be. So I started researching online, and I found that when it came to his cleans and his slightly more broken up stuff, there seemed to be a general consensus that he was using something called an MXR micro amp. Now, outside of a very select few instances, I had never even dived into the world of MXR pedals before. I had never heard of the micro amp, but everyone seemed to be over and over again freaking out about this one knob pedal, so I decided it's cheap, I might as well give it a chance. So I'm online trying to look for one of these things. I eventually find my way to Facebook Marketplace, and while I'm there, I end up meeting this guy who says he's in a rock band who says he has one. So I'm like, hey dude, let's meet at this Japanese restaurant so I can get this. So I get in my car and I drive over to this restaurant, and I get out and I see the dude, I shake his hand, and we just start talking about life, about different things about his band, about how he uses the pedal, and eventually he hands it over, I hand him the money. I don't even try this thing out because it's a cheap pedal and I trust this guy. I get back in my car and I drive straight home. All right, so as soon as I get home, I am a different level of excited. I think because I realize I've never really owned a boost pedal like this before. I've had overdrives, I've had distortions, but nothing that specifically works the way people are saying the micro amp is supposed to. So I turn it on and I pair it with my amp, and I immediately start making a video about it. And in the video, I stated that I was super excited because not only was this a pedal that John Frusciante uses, but he was known for pairing it with a different pedal that I'd recently gotten called a Boss DS1. I had specifically gotten a version that had just released called the Wazacraft, so I was extra intrigued with how well it was going to fit in. So I finished the video, I finished getting the tones, and I'm listening back through my speakers, and I'm actually checking through the comments, and immediately notice that I've been corrected, which is the thing I love most about this platform. They're like, homie, listen up real quick, because Red Hot Chili Pepper fans, and specifically Frusciante fans, they know their stuff. They were like, John has been on record using the DS1 once or twice, but the pedal that I think you're thinking of that he's most famous for is actually the DS2, like the Turbo. Now, being a lifelong Tube Screamer guy and never having really used any Boss overdrive pedals outside of the few times that I played through my friend's Blues Driver in college, I had to start doing more research on what the difference were between these two things and why it was so important that John used the DS2 instead of the DS1. I found that the first setting on the two pedals essentially have the same layout, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they have the same exact tone. And setting 2 on the DS2 as opposed to the original DS1 actually allows you to have more gain, which is the one that Frusciante uses. Now, all of this was a lot to take in, especially since from what I was reading, both pedals seem to have a pretty similar circuit, even though they sound different, especially those who happen to have a pretty big ear for Frusciante. And as someone who very recently found that he was intrigued in recreating some of those legendary tones that had inspired me over the past 5 to 10 years, I decided it was about time to actually see how close the DS2 could get me to, that Frusciante tone. Okay, so really it all kind of starts with the guitar, right? And would you look at that? So here's pretty much the deal. As a lover and collector of Strats, I have a couple that I've gotten over the years, and picking which one was harder than I thought. But knowing that Frusciante is an SSS single coil guy all the way, I had to go with something that I knew had a single coil in the bridge, even if I usually do a humbucker. Now, with Strat in hand, you'd think that my first move would obviously be to go to the amp. What amp is he using? What settings? Whatever. But I actually found something interesting. When I was listening back to a lot of the tracks on Blood Sugar Magic, specifically Wet Sand, I was like, wait, I feel like he's not using an amp here. He's just going straight into the console. So I researched it, and it's true. So to recreate some of those tones, I literally just went DI into the compressor. Now, doing my research, I did find that whether or not he uses a compressor or the compression is just coming from the breakup of the amp, that's apparently a hot button issue. Just listening back to this and a couple other tracks, I was hearing a little bit of compression. But once I got past the whole compression thing and into the actual amp tones, that's where things got really, really big. I know that the amp choice and the amp settings are just as significant as any of the pedals that he's using and trying to get that specific sound to match it. So I wanted to get something as close as I could to the Marshall stack because I know he plays Marshalls and Fenders. Now, I personally have never actually owned a Marshall head or anything even close to like a Silver Jubilee or the JCM 800, but I do happen to have a Tonex. Now, there were a lot of JCM 800s that I found that people had modeled, but it was really about finding the right one and also pairing that with the different amp settings, because in my research finding that John tends to use a lot more treble on the amp than I'm used to. I usually try and back off and get a bassier sound, but once I was able to dial those in, I felt like I was getting pretty close. And trust me, I like that sound, but once I turned on the micro amp, it was a whole different ballgame. And finally, as you probably could have guessed from the beginning of the video, the real magic doesn't actually begin until we start stacking the micro amp with the DS2 and you find out why it has the name Turbo. There are a lot of situations that I found, more specifically in one of their biggest hits of the early 2000s, which is Can't Stop, where he'll have the micro amp on for the main riff and he'll have it in the bridge position, and you can really hear it being kind of driven but not being overly distorted. Once a solo comes in and you have the DS2, it's a completely different song. Now that's really exciting, but there is something that you have to be very careful about, and those are the specific settings on the DS2. Because upon originally looking into it and doing all this research, I was seeing everyone saying that the DS2 is dimed in Frusciante's settings. A lot of people think that's a common misconception. If you look at pictures from his board, specifically from the last tour, not everything is necessarily dimed. Right now I have the level and the tone at about 3 o'clock, and I have the distortion just a little bit over halfway. But I think pedals like the DS2 are so powerful that you don't really need to dime it and do the Van Halen thing. Even for like a lot of the heavier sounds like the Danny Californias. It's not always about diming it out and cranking it as much as possible, although sometimes that's appropriate. It's really about finding that sweet spot. So here's kind of the moral of the story and what I'm taking away from all this. Tone, it definitely matters, but I don't think that's necessarily the hottest take in the world. What I'm learning more and more as I discover new pieces of gear, new sounds that I'd like to emulate from my heroes, is that the gear that they use does matter, but what's just as important is finding out the different ways that they use it and finding out why different settings work the way they do and why you like the sounds that you like. And I'm not saying that there aren't times where people definitely could be nicer to each other in the comments and the forums, but I think there's a reason why all this debate is necessary around certain pieces of gear, because we want to get to the root of why John Frusciante sounds the way that he does, how Jimi Hendrix gets his fuzz tone, how Eric Clapton is able to blow us away with his woman tone. All of that stuff matters in all of us becoming better guitar players at the end of the day and finding out how to push it forward even from there. Frusciante happens to be a very specific guitar hero for me, whose tone happens to be so recognizable and so specific that I feel like it was a great way to get into the world of not just the gear that he uses, but how he uses it. Does he max out the volume and tone? How does he use it in accordance with the MXR micro amp? All of those things, and I think those things are actively going to make all of us better players. But at the end of the day, I don't think it matters what I think. What matters is what you think. So please tell me, are you a Frusciante fan? What do you think is the best way to get his tones? How do you think I could have done better? Please let me know in the comments. Anyways, thank you so much for watching this video. It was so much fun just to be able to recreate one of my favorite tones from my heroes. I've been wanting to get on the DS2 for a long time, ever since I figured out, like I said before, about the DS1. If you want to know anything about about the DS2 or the DS1 or any of the other pedals that I use in this video, the links are in the description. Make sure to check them out. One of the best ways to support the channel if that's something you want to do, or if you're just curious about any of the other gear that I use in this video, make sure to check out those links. Also, thank you so much to my patrons. There's more extra stuff on there if you want to check it out. Like and subscribe if you had a good time, and most importantly, most important of all, have a Frusciante-tastic day.